All right. Good afternoon. Bon après-midi tout le monde. Je voudrais maintenant vous présenter une amie et une collègue qui a participé à la préparation, l'organisation de cet événement. This is now the beginning of the Quebec part, or the provincial part of our event. This afternoon we have a keynote lecture and then a roundtable. The keynote lecture will be in English, but the roundtable will be mostly in French. As you know, we have a simultaneous translation available. So if you want, from English to French, French to English, it's available on the left outside of this door, and you can take a device with you if you want or need simultaneous translation. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mireille Paquet, who is Concordia Research Chair on the Politics of Immigration and Associate Professor of Political Science at Concordia. Our current research agenda analyzes policy and political discourses to understand the politics of immigration in Canada in comparative settings, with a specific focus on the roles played by administrative institutions, political parties, and different forms of knowledge. She is also leading research on the evolution of Canadian and Quebec immigration policies. She is currently the scientific lead of the FRQSC-funded Équipe de recherche sur l'immigration au Québec et ailleurs, ERICA, I hope it's the way you say it, in French, and just directed Dynamique de l'immigration au Québec, published this fall at Presse de l'Université de Montréal. Mireille, c'est à toi.
Merci beaucoup, Daniel. Comme Daniel a dit, je vais faire ma présentation en anglais parce que plusieurs des choses dont je vais parler aujourd'hui sont le résultat de publications en français. Donc, je veux m'assurer que les personnes qui ne parlent pas français soient en mesure de comprendre ce qui se passe. Puis vous savez aussi qu'il y a quand même beaucoup de méconnaissances encore à l'échelle du Canada sur les réalités québécoises. Alors, je serais contente, par contre, ensuite de pouvoir prendre des questions en français ou en anglais. So thank you, Daniel. It's an honor to be invited to speak at the conference. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that the ideas that I'll share with you today come from my work, but also the work of my colleague from Équipe de recherche sur l'immigration au Québec et ailleurs, and you called it ERICA, indeed. Some of them are actually here today, so that includes Catherine Hardet, Antoine Bilodeau, Adèle Garnier, but also our dynamic students, some of them also here today, who dedicate their time and energy to develop new knowledge about new immigration dynamics in Quebec. So my argument today is that Quebec has now definitely entered a new phase of its immigration politics, and that we need to think about the implication of this new era more seriously. To be sure, though, immigration is not a new reality in Quebec. At its core, the province is part of a settler state that has historically demanded and used immigration to replace the indigenous population with chosen citizens from abroad. And Quebec's history has also been and is shaped by successory migratory movement and a debate over the relationship between different governments when it comes to immigration. And it's easy to forget the world travel and the pretty amazing transformation that the province has experienced in the past 60 years. Still, important changes are underway, and we need to think about those changes. These changes signal the transformation of Quebec's relation with immigration. We need to invest time and energy to understand them because they will affect the experiences of newcomers. I'd actually argue they already do. You know, the experience of newcomers in Quebec right now is completely different than the one they experienced maybe 20 years ago. And that these changes also in the long term will change Quebec's identity and the politics of thinking about immigration in the province. Now I'll try to change a slide, okay? Wish me luck. Yes. Okay, so what I'll do today is I'll show that Quebec's third phase of immigration policy, or this new era, is characterized by three things. First, a growing politicization of immigration issues. Second, the transformation of Quebec's immigration program into a full-fledged two-step immigration system. And I'm sorry I've been scooped this morning, but I'll also keep on talking about this. And finally, the rise of Quebec as a destination for unplanned immigration movement. And for the rest of the talk, I won't do my air quotes, but you get it, okay? So don't ever quote me without my air quote. This is first visible because of irregular border crossings at Roxham Road. And while these arrivals are not as large as compared to what's going on more globally, they signal a very important change for Quebec, because Quebec all of a sudden realizes that it's not an isolated island in face of global migration patterns. So why is this important? Well, in describing these characteristics, I'll show you that they represent a break from previous periods of the Quebec's immigration history and of Quebec's relationship with immigration. And I'll highlight the implication of this new era for immigrants, for Quebec, and for the relationship between the province and Ottawa. But first, to better see the change at play, it's worth taking a step back. Thinking about Quebec's immigration politics, which I define as a group of stable and organizing feature of the political behavior, debates, ideas, and policies, two periods have been especially understood or have been discussed. The first one is behind me, right? We can describe this phase as one of province building through immigration, starting with the Quiet Revolution. What you see on the picture is the first welcome office at the Dorval airport, when Dorval still received international flights, of the Quebec government. So Quebec had created this little output so that it could welcome immigrants coming. So after years of inaction over immigration, provincial control over the issue of who comes into the province became a central feature of the Quiet Revolution politics. Immigration was part of the demand for decentralization and later for constitutional reform for Quebec, and that was from all political parties. So not just Parti québécois, but Parti libéral, Union, les créditistes, l'Union nationale, all of that. And here, control over immigration during that period was seen as a way to neutralize linguistic threats associated with immigration, whether they were true or not truly threat. The province also, during this period, and I think it's important to remember, the picture shows this, the province invested in state capacity to manage immigration. They built a public administration, and they also invested resources in the development of innovative policy interventions to try to achieve their immigration goal. This was part of a larger process of state building. And so at its core, during the Quiet Revolution, immigration was part of that process. And during that period, immigration issues were very salient. But most of that political salience focused on conflict with Ottawa. So it was all about federal-provincial relations and whether actually Ottawa could give more power to the province. A second phase that I, for now, call a phase of normal politics started in 1991 when Quebec signed the current agreement that we have with the federal government. So the Canada-Quebec Accord at that point gave Quebec unprecedented power. Quebec has a capacity to select a large portion of its economic immigrants as well as to help in refugee sponsorship. Quebec is entirely responsible for immigrant integration and receives a large amount of money from Ottawa when it comes to fund immigration services. This agreement, I've shown in my work, has ushered the start of a new period in the province's politics because it has provided a relative neutralization of the linguistic threat that was central to immigration politics before then. All of a sudden, Quebec had the capacity to decide who came in, and for them it was, let's have Francophone. It really changed what was the meaning of immigration. Doing that has actually depoliticized immigration and de-linked it to intergovernmental relation or issues of federalism. This period is characterized by the low salience of immigration in Quebec's immigration politics and of incremental growth in immigrant intake. So during the period, while there are like little bleeps, overall immigration levels rise. And this period is also characterized by the establishment of a general elite consensus, especially visible among political parties. And we forget that because we're clearly somewhere else. But, you know, from Parti québécois to Parti libéral, most parties and the most mainstream party agreed when it came to the role of immigration for Quebec society, the need to continue to have high level of immigration, and also the need not to politicize these issues. And I want to acknowledge here that this consensus is not only because people are nice, it also was the result of a new taboo that was established in 1995 after the Quebec referendum, when Parizeau made pretty regrettable comments about immigration. This little moment actually had the effect of rendering taboo the expression of multiple anti-immigration views in the public sphere. Not saying that they didn't occur, but all of a sudden it became very difficult for a political party to actually talk about wanting to limit immigration or change integration policies. I want to say today that this new politics has ended. Clearly, this period of normal is over, and we're now fully into a new phase. So in the rest of my presentation, I'll discuss what I consider to be the three most important features of this politics: the politicization of immigration issue, the emergence of a two-step migration system, and the presence of the position of Quebec as a destination for unplanned, again, arrival. So the first most visible change affecting Quebec's immigration politics, and some of you that live in Quebec know about this, has been the politicization of immigration issues since the 2006, but especially since 2012. And here I want to say that I build on my work with Catherine Hardet, who's going to be talking later on, in which we consider politicization as both in terms of rising salience as well as in terms of polarization. So, I've put what I consider to be my top 5 or 4, declaration in the last couple of years. I'm not saying that I agree with any of those, but, they're kind of clear illustration of the kind of language that has been circulating in a very mainstream way, right? So you have, for example, Mathieu Bock-Côté, who's writing Chronicle every couple of days, multiple and all over the place, saying things like there's massive migration and it's suicidal. You have Éric Duhem, who still is the leader of the Quebec Parti conservateur, linking irregular arrival at the Roxham Road with COVID. You have also more coded language, for example, the declaration from François Legault on top here saying we're going to take less immigrants, but we're going to take better care of them. So these declarations were not declarations that would have been possible earlier. So the third phase of Quebec's immigration politics signals both kind of the emergence of these comments, but also the end of a partisan consensus on the role of immigration for the province. So the consensus I was talking about after 1991 is now gone. And it's observable in multiple ways. So if you were in Quebec earlier this month, you know that immigration is now being featured heavily in the last 2 provincial elections, which in itself is actually pretty new. It's also worth noting that position taking by Quebec parties on immigration have become much more differentiated. So first off, parties have position, which they didn't really used to have, but they're also much more distant. Media attention towards immigration has increased since 2010 in the province, but also in a context of the fragmentation of our media ecosystem, multiple columnists have kind of emerged as spokesperson of anti-immigrant views. But I want to also say, and these tweets point to that, behaviors have also changed. So leaders feel much more comfortable taking original stance about immigration during campaign, and they also are very openly okay with relaying false information or using tropes, tapping into fears and insecurity about immigration. And that's a norm shift that is, I think, important, and we need to think about it. Well, this is not new for multiple regions in the world. I know this is a comparative conference, right? If you compare some of these declarations to what happens in other parts of the world, this is, bad, but, on a scale of bad, it's not the worst. I think that it's important to realize how big of a move it is away from the characteristic of the previous phase. And so why does this matter, right? So I'd say 2 things. First off, it matters because the politicization of immigration affects the nature of the policy discussion when it comes to immigration. Comparative research has shown that immigration politicization increases focus on restricting frames and restrictive policy intervention. Since Quebec is now facing new immigration challenges that I'll talk about in a minute, this is likely to have serious consequences on our capacity to actually think about how we can fix the problem or engage in policy reform, because the space in which we're able to think about solution is much smaller. And I'd also say that it matters because politicization is contagious, and I'm not the one like inventing this, research has shown it. Politicization and polarization in the immigration system, they are system-wide phenomenon, right? And over time, it's been shown that it pushes all parties and all political leaders to engage in position-taking and increase differentiation, which again, usually reinforces restrictive position. And this is especially important for Quebec because we are in the middle of a party restructuring. So we don't really know, what's going on with the CAQ. Well, we know what's going on with the CAQ. They won the election, but we don't know who's going to be really the next real natural opposition and how this is going to play out in the future. So this means that for us, immigration-related issues could become a much more structuring cleavage in the province in years to come. That's something that's been suggested by Jean-François Godbout and Éric Bélanger, and I think that is something we really need to think about. The second feature that I want to talk to you about is something that was discussed already this morning. It's the transformation of Quebec's immigration program into a full-fledged two-step immigration system. So the graph behind me traces the evolution of permanent and temporary migration streams in Quebec since the early 2000s. The evidence is pretty striking. Temporary immigration has grown much faster than permanent immigration in the province, and this trend is not ready to stop with increasing demand for just-in-time migration and labor shortages. And this matters because it changed at its core the experiences of newcomers in Quebec. Dr. Elric talked about that today, right? That we have structured a system with the assumption that people come for permanent settlement, and we have not adjusted several of our institutions to this new reality. Research after research in Quebec and elsewhere has shown that temporary migration permit increase overall status precarity and risk exploitation, something that Dr. Tungogan talked about. And with this broader trend, a growing proportion of immigrant landing in Quebec experience deep insecurity associated with a status in limbo and cannot be certain of whether they will be able to remain in the province in the long run. Some of them might not, but some of them might very well, and they really cannot plan. This is much more than a quantitative change. It is an existential change to our immigration system that had been created, again, as of the 1960s as a permanent-based system. And what this figure does not capture is that a growing number of the people that are counted in the blue line, so as permanent immigrants, are actually people that have transitioned from temporary to permanency. So that means that the space is actually much faster and that for much bigger, and that for the majority of people who become permanent resident in Quebec, this is through a process that is much longer, that is much more uncertain, and is much more fraught with insecurity. And we've seen also that in Quebec, the government has been quite willing to completely overhaul programs that allow for people to move into permanency. For example, the Programme d'Expérience Québécoise, and to do so on a whim without offering any protection to the people whose lives have been completely affected. So this means effectively, again, that Quebec is now operating a two-step immigration system in which the majority of newcomers to the province come under conditional and precarious streams and must then gamble on the possibility of being able to remain in Quebec. And in that process, we're also asking them to learn French within 6 months. So why does this matter? It matters because it is a change that occurred through policy drift. And it has been reinforced by recent decision to lower permanent immigration intake, which you could kind of see. There's a COVID bleep, but there's still kind of a downward trend starting in 2018. It is not the result of a clearly defined policy reform, and it has not been communicated to citizens. Such a major transformation, especially because it has very deep implication for the vulnerabilities of those involved, but also because it provides so much powers to employers and universities to name a few. How to be understood by citizens, how to be debated, even though we're not sure whether we want to debate things about immigration. But it's really important because it has implication for the whole of Quebec society. It also matters because, well, Quebec here follows a Canada-wide trend, right? So we've talked about this morning, and this is not special in Quebec. Quebec's two-step immigration system is especially inefficient. It is marred by delays and backlog that increase the vulnerability of those hoping to access permanent status, on top of Quebec's long-standing problems with immigrant integration in the economic sphere, issues of language integration, and the resulting out-migration. Again, here, drift has also meant that the policy has eschewed any investment in state capacity, which was so important in the first phase of Quebec's immigration policy. And that means that immigrants are not allowed to make the most out of that system if we, for example, engage with some of the ideas that Anna told us about, that there's something agentic also about, being able to engage in temporary migration. And I'd argue also that little is known about the effect of this trial period on immigrants' feeling of belonging to Quebec society, which has been a real challenge for government, right? So we want people in Quebec to feel like they can integrate into society, engage with a national project, learn French, and things like that. Research has told us that those going through a two-step migration process, especially those at the top, right? They tend to fare much better in the labor market as compared to other immigrants. But that's only part of the story, right? Experiencing limbo for a long time, experiencing insecurity, means that your relationship with state institution is affected and your desire to participate in society also changes. So as Quebec is still heavily relying on immigration for demographic and economic survival, we really ought to think about what kind of citizens we are creating and helping create through those programs. The final characteristics, The final characteristic that I want to highlight about this politics is the impact of the rise of Quebec as a destination for unplanned, here quote again, immigration movement to Canada. This is first visible as with irregular border crossing at Roxham Road, and here my data shows this, but these manifestations will increase in years to come with things like climate migration, climate displacement, as well as tons of other things. And here I build on my work with Robert Schweitzer, which has graciously been supported by the IRPP. So if you're interested, you can find a nice report about this that's accessible to all. So as the graph behind me shows, irregular arrival at the Canada-US border have increased tremendously since 2017, and have grown even more since the lifting of pandemic restrictions. The partial bar for 2022 is already higher, and the year has not even ended. These arrivals are a function of the Third Safe Country Agreement between Canada and the United States, and an overwhelming number of these people will submit asylum claim in Canada and then be engaged in often extremely long delay to even have their claim here. Again, here, for our non-Canadian guests, these numbers will appear comparatively small, but they're deeply significant, I would argue, for Quebec and more broadly for Canada. For one thing, they represent a shock to the system for Quebec citizens who had been rarely engaged with discussion about terms like migration crisis, illegal migration, again here, all those air quotes, and never really thought of themselves as potentially being affected by global forces creating displacement or having to, and I don't mean to say that Quebec does not have a history of supporting humanitarian migration, but it's always been, as was discussed this morning, through a realm of control and potential selectivity. This also reinforces tropes about bogus refugees and queue jumpers that have been salient in Canadian politics since 2010 and have been remobilized by some provincial leaders. But here, as the number in red are showing, This is more a Quebec phenomenon than a Canada phenomenon. So the numbers in red are the percentage of the arrivals that are staying in the province. So it's over 90% every year of the people crossing irregularly that are doing so in Quebec. As a result, Quebec is experiencing itself for the first time as a destination of unplanned migration. And this is a massive shift that shows no sign of ending. Canada will not renegotiate the STCA, and I have little, sadly, hope for what's going to happen in the Supreme Court. And the global drivers of these population movement will continue and increase in years to come. So we can expect a lot more action at this border point as well as in other border points. So why does this matter? Right? I propose that this matters because, as I was saying before, that means that the politics of immigration in Quebec is no longer that of an isolated island focused on our own internal little fight. While our mainstream debates were limited for a long time on issues of the selection grid, how much skill, how much French level, whether people should learn French before, after, these arrival means that there's new teams that are coming into the political sphere in political debate. These teams include border control, coercive enforcement, but also pressures on social services brought by these super diverse population, which increasingly, and these will increasingly feature in debates and raise new anxieties in the population. That mixes with the kind of politicization that we talked about and norm shifting about how you can talk about immigration. These arrivals also matter because they raise a new set of tension between Ottawa and the provinces. How Ottawa should control the border. That's been a big theme from François Legault, right? Like, Ottawa just has to close Roxham Road. It's like, well, yeah. Who should pay for these arrivals, right? How to speed up the administrative backlog on the processing of these. Who should house these people in the short term and in the long term? What kind of competition for social services arise from these arrivals? And there are no simple solutions to these questions, and there are no simple solutions in this file. And as a result, new waves of open intergovernmental conflict and immigration are to be expected. So new waves of open fight over the immigration issues between Ottawa and the province will come after 20 years of relative peace brought forward by the Canada-Quebec agreement. And I'd argue that ultimately this matters because these arrivals undo part of the feeling of safety that Quebec achieved through its winning of the control over immigration selection in the 1990s. At that point, it was about controlling this linguistic threat and this fear about who comes in and their impact on the Francophone, the French fact in Quebec. Here we have a new type of threat, right? Irregular arrival challenge this feeling of relative control, and this can have tremendous effect on citizens' attitude towards this issue and political strategies surrounding it. Okay. So in closing, I want to add a word of caution, right? So I argue that there's a new politics of immigration in Quebec, and we need to think about it. But I think that it would be easy for all of us thinking about this to describe a lot of what I just talked about as a peculiar Quebec reaction to global movement. And with this idea and this common misconception that Quebecers might be really deeply and profoundly less comfortable with immigration than other Canadians, and so that as a result, this is only what we're seeing. I think that keen observer, however, will note that a lot of the elements discussed in this presentation are also operating at the national scale, as well as operating in other regions, from BC to Alberta. And so from here in Montreal, it could be easy and comfortable to consider that Canada is immune to changing dynamics of immigration politics. And I think that that would be self-congratulatory and invalidating for those who experience rising anti-immigrant backlash across the country and, just not true when you look at what's happening in national politics. Instead, with my presentation today, I would argue that in addition to furthering our national conversation about immigration, because after all, Quebec is still part of Canada as far as I'm concerned, Quebec experience should be used to understand what can be expected in years to come in Canada. and to explore the impact of policy decision or policy drift in our country's immigration politics. So to do this, I would finally just like to propose that we need to engage seriously, both as citizens and as scholars, with two things. So first off, we need to realize that this is not episodic, this is systemic, right? This is here to stay, and so we need to think about this as a new reality. We need to think about our political strategy, if that's what you like to do in relation to that, or if you're writing books and paper, you need to think about this as well. And I think that more broadly, this shows, and this was also a trend in the discussion this morning, that we need a new societal bargain when it comes to immigration in Canada that will include new kind of policy intervention that address new type of vulnerability, as well as new type of misinformation, new type of politicization, and all the risks that can be associated with a third phase of immigration politics. That's it. Oh, no, it's not it. If you're interested in this, we have a book that talks about this at the Presse de l'Université de Montréal, but I've also included references to papers with co-authors that really kind of document a lot more the things that I've talked about this afternoon. If you would like copies of these, just find me during the break, and I'll be happy to share them with you.